Switch 3 surprises about change 1. One Saturday in 2000, some unsuspecting moviegoers showed up at a suburban theater in Chicago to catch a 1:05 p.m. matinee of Mel Gibson's action flick Payback. They were handed a soft drink and a free bucket of popcorn, and were asked to stick around after the movie, to answer a few questions about the concession stand. These movie fans were unwitting participants in a study of irrational eating behavior. There was something unusual about the popcorn they received. It was wretched. In fact, it had been carefully engineered to be wretched. It had been popped 5 days earlier, and was so stale that it squeaked when you ate it. One moviegoer later compared it to styrofoam packing peanuts, and 2 others, forgetting that they'd received the popcorn for free, demanded their money back. Some of them got their free popcorn in a medium-sized bucket, 2 and others got a large bucket, the sort of huge tub that looks like it might once have been an above-ground swimming pool. Every person got a bucket, so there'd be no need to share. The researchers responsible for the study were interested in a simple question: would the people with bigger buckets eat more? Both buckets were so big that none of the moviegoers could finish their individual portions. So the actual research question was a bit more specific: would somebody with a larger inexhaustible supply of popcorn eat more than someone with a smaller inexhaustible supply? The sneaky researchers weighed the buckets before and after the movie, so they were able to measure precisely how much popcorn each person ate. The results were stunning. People with the large buckets ate 53% more popcorn than people with a medium size. That's the equivalent of 173 more calories and approximately 21 extra hand dips into the bucket. Brian Wansink, the author of the study, runs the Food and Brand Lab at Cornell University, and he described the results in his book Mindless Eating. We've run other popcorn studies, and the results were always the same, however we tweaked the details. It didn't matter if our moviegoers were in Pennsylvania, Illinois, or Iowa, and it didn't matter what kind of movie was showing, all of our popcorn studies led to the same conclusion. People eat more when you give them a bigger container. Period. No other theory explains the behavior. These people weren't eating for pleasure. The popcorn was so stale it squeaked. They weren't driven by a desire to finish their portion. Both buckets were too big to finish. It didn't matter whether they were hungry or full. The equation is unyielding: bigger container, more eating. Best of all, people refused to believe the results. After the movie, the researchers told the moviegoers about the 2 bucket sizes and the findings of their past research. The researchers asked, IJLRLL1I, Earl, Achk, AHUUUIIGIILC, do you think you ate more because of the larger size? The majority scoffed at the idea, saying things like that don't trick me, or I'm pretty good at knowing when I'm full. Whoops. 2. Imagine that someone showed you the data from the popcorn eating study, but didn't mention the bucket sizes. On your data summary, you could quickly scan the results and see how much popcorn different people ate. Some people ate a little, some ate a lot, and some seemed to be testing the physical limits of the human stomach. Armed with a data set like that, you would find it easy to jump to conclusions. Some people are reasonable snackers, and others are big gluttons. A public health expert, studying that data alongside you, would likely get very worried about the gluttons. We need to motivate these people to adopt healthier snacking behaviors. Let's find ways to show them the health hazards of eating so much. But wait a second. If you want people to eat less popcorn, the solution is pretty simple: give them smaller buckets. You don't have to worry about their knowledge or their attitudes. You can see how easy it would be to turn an easy change problem shrinking people's buckets into a hard change problem convincing people to think differently. And that's the first surprise about change: what looks like a people problem is often a situation problem. 3. This is a book to help you change things. We consider change at every level: individual, organizational, and societal. Maybe you 4. Want to help your brother beat his gambling addiction. Maybe you need your team at work to act more frugally because of market conditions. Maybe you wish more of your neighbors would bike to work. Usually these topics are treated separately. There is change management advice for executives and self-help advice for individuals, and change the world advice for activists. That's a shame, because all change efforts have something in common. For anything to change, someone has to start acting differently. Your brother has got to stay out of the casino, your employees have got to start booking coach fares. Ultimately, all change efforts boil down to the same mission: can you get people to start behaving in a new way? We know what you're thinking: people resist change. But it's not quite that easy. Babies are born every day to parents who, inexplicably, welcome the change. Think about the sheer magnitude of that change. Would anyone agree to work for a boss who'd wake you up twice a night, screaming, for trivial administrative duties? And what if, every time you wore a new piece of clothing, the boss spit up on it? Yet people don't resist this massive change, they volunteer for it. In our lives, we embrace lots of big changes: not only babies, but marriages and new homes and new technologies and new job duties. Meanwhile, other behaviors are maddeningly intractable. Smokers keep smoking and kids grow fatter, and your husband can't ever seem to get his dirty shirts into a hamper. So there are hard changes and easy changes. What distinguishes one from the other? In this book, we argue that successful changes share a common pattern. They require the leader of the change to do 3 things at once. We've already mentioned one of those 3 things: to change someone's behavior, you've got to change that person's situation. Jerpro 5E5ADOUT. Nuns, the situation isn't the whole game, of course. You can send an alcoholic to rehab, where the new environment will help him go dry. But what happens when he leaves and loses that influence? You might see a boost in productivity from your sales reps when the sales manager shadows them, but what happens afterward when the situation returns to normal? For individuals' behavior to change, you've got to influence not only their environment but their hearts and minds. The problem is this: often the heart and mind disagree fervently. 4. Consider the clocky, an alarm clock invented by an MIT student, Gauri Nanda. It's no ordinary alarm clock, it has wheels. You set it at night, and in the morning, when the alarm goes off, it rolls off your nightstand and scurries around the room, forcing you to chase it down. Picture the scene: you're crawling around the bedroom in your underwear, stalking and cursing a runaway clock. Clocky ensures that you won't snooze but in your way to disaster. And apparently that's a common fear, since about 35,000 units were purchased, at $50 each, in Clocky's first 2 years on the market despite minimal marketing. The success of this invention reveals a lot about human psychology. What it shows, fundamentally, is that we are schizophrenic. Part of us, our rational side, wants to get up at 5:45 a.m., allowing ourselves plenty of time for a quick jog, before we leave for the office. The other part of us, the emotional side, wakes up in the darkness of the early morning, snoozing inside a warm cocoon of sheets and blankets, and wants nothing in the world so much as a few more minutes of sleep. If, like us, your emotional side tends to win these internal debates, then you might be a potential Clocky customer. The beauty of the device is that it allows your rational side to outsmart your emotional side. It's simply impossible to stay cuddled up under the covers when a rogue alarm clock is rolling around your room. Let's be blunt here: Clocky is not a product for a sane species. If Spock wants to get up at 5:45 a.m., he'll just get up. No drama required. Our built-in schizophrenia is a deeply weird thing, but we don't think much about it because we are so used to it. When we kick off a new diet, we toss the Cheetos and Oreos out of the pantry, because our rational side knows that when our emotional side gets a craving, there's no hope of self-control. The only option is to remove the temptation altogether. For the record, some MIT student will make a fortune designing Cheetos that scurry away from people when they're on a diet. The unavoidable conclusion is this: your brain isn't of one mind. The conventional wisdom in psychology, in fact, is that the brain has two independent systems at work at all times. First, there's what we call the emotional side. It's the part of you that is instinctive, that feels pain and pleasure. Second, there's the rational side, also known as the reflective or conscious system. It's the part of you that deliberates, and analyzes and looks into the future. In the past few decades, psychologists have learned a lot about these two systems, but of course mankind has always been aware of the tension. Plato said that in our heads we have a rational charioteer, who has to rein in an unruly horse, that barely yields to horsewhip and goad combined. Freud wrote about the selfish ate and the conscientious superego, and also about the ego, which ate. Plan to think beyond the moment, all those things that your pet can't do. But what may surprise you is that the elephant also has enormous strengths, and that the rider has crippling weaknesses. The elephant isn't always the bad guy. Emotion is the elephant's turf: love and compassion and sympathy and loyalty. That fierce instinct you have to protect your kids against harm, that's the elephant. That spine stiffening you feel when you need to stand up for yourself, that's the elephant. And even more important, if you're contemplating a change, the elephant is the one who gets things done. To make progress toward a goal, whether it's noble or crass, requires the energy and drive of the elephant. And the strength is the mirror image of the rider's great weakness: spinning his wheels. The rider tends to overanalyze and overthink things. Chances are, you know people with rider problems: your friend who can agonize for 20 minutes about what to eat for dinner, your colleague who can brainstorm about new ideas for hours, but can't ever seem to make a decision. If you want to change things, you've got to appeal to both. The rider provides the planning and direction, and the elephant provides the energy. So if you reach the riders of your team but not the elephants, team members will have understanding without motivation. If you reach their elephants but not their riders, they'll have passion without direction. In both cases, the flaws can be paralyzing. A reluctant elephant and a wheel-spinning rider can both ensure that nothing changes. But when elephants and riders move together, change can come easily. 5. When rider and elephant disagree about which way to move, you've got a problem. The rider can get his way temporarily. THREESURPRISESABOUTC-9 can tug on the reins hard enough to get the elephant to submit. Anytime you use willpower, you're doing exactly that. But the rider can't win a tug-of-war with a huge animal for long. He simply gets exhausted. To see this point more clearly, consider the behavior of some college students who participated in a study about food perception, or so they were told. They reported to the lab a bit hungry. They'd been asked not to eat for at least 3 hours beforehand. They were led to a room that smelled amazing. The researchers had just baked chocolate chip cookies. On a table in the center of the room were 2 bowls. One held a sampling of chocolates, along with the warm, fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies they'd smelled. The other bowl held a bunch of radishes. The researchers had prepped a cover story: "We've selected chocolates and radishes because they have highly distinctive tastes. Tomorrow, we'll contact you and ask about your memory of the taste sensations you experienced while eating them." Half the participants were asked to eat 2 or 3 cookies and some chocolate candies, but no radishes. The other half were asked to eat at least 2 or 3 radishes, but no cookies. While they ate, the researchers left the room, intending, rather sadistically, to induce temptation. They wanted those poor radish eaters to sit there, alone, nibbling on rabbit food, glancing enviously at the fresh-baked cookies. It probably goes without saying that the cookie eaters experienced no great struggle in resisting the radishes. Despite the temptation, all participants ate what they were asked to eat, and none of the radish eaters snuck a cookie. That's willpower at work. At that point, the taste study was officially over, and another group of researchers entered with a second, supposedly unrelated study. We are trying to find who's better at solving problems. 10. College students or high school students. This framing was intended to get the college students to puff out their chests and take the forthcoming task seriously. The college students were presented with a series of puzzles that required them to trace a complicated geometric shape without retracing any lines and without lifting their pencils from the paper. They were given multiple sheets of paper so they could try over and over. In reality, the puzzles were designed to be unsolvable. The researchers wanted to see how long the college students would persist in a difficult, frustrating task before they finally gave up. The tempted students, who had not had to resist eating the chocolate chip cookies, spent 19 minutes on the task, making 34 well-intentioned attempts to solve the problem. The radish eaters were less persistent. They gave up after only 8 minutes, less than half the time spent by the cookie eaters, and they managed only 19 solution attempts. Why did they quit so easily? The answer may surprise you: they ran out of self-control. In studies like this one, psychologists have discovered that self-control is an inexhaustible resource. It's like doing bench presses at the gym. The first one is easy, when your muscles are fresh. But with each additional repetition, your muscles get more exhausted, until you can't lift the bar again. The radish eaters had drained their self-control by resisting the cookies. So when their elephants, inevitably, started complaining about the puzzle task, "It's too hard, it's no fun, we're no good at this," their riders didn't have enough strength to yank on the reins for more than 8 minutes. Meanwhile, the cookie eaters had a fresh, untaxed rider, who fought off the elephant for 19 minutes. Self-control is an inexhaustible resource. This is a crucial realization, because when we talk about self-control, we don't mean 1. The narrow sense of the word, as in the willpower needed to fight vice, smokes, cookies, alcohol. We are talking about a broader kind of self-supervision. Think of the way your mind works when you're giving negative feedback to an employee, or assembling a new bookshelf, or learning a new dance. You are careful and deliberate with your words or movements. It feels like there's a supervisor on duty. That's self-control. Contrast that with all the situations in which your behavior doesn't feel supervised. For instance, the sensation, while you're driving, that you can remember the last few miles of road, or the easy, unthinking way you take a shower or make your morning coffee. Much of our daily behavior, in fact, is more automatic than supervised, and that's a good thing, because the supervised behavior is the hard stuff. It's draining. Dozens of studies have demonstrated the exhausting nature of self-supervision. For instance, people who were asked to make tricky choices and trade-offs, such as setting up a wedding registry or ordering a new computer, were worse at focusing and solving problems than others, who hadn't made the tough choices. In one study, some people were asked to restrain their emotions while watching a sad movie about sick animals. Afterward, they exhibited less physical endurance than others, who let the tears flow freely. The research shows that we burn up self-control in a wide variety of situations: managing the impression we are making on others, coping with fears, controlling our spending, trying to focus on simple instructions, such as "don't think of a white bear," and many, many others. Here's why this matters for change. When people try to change things, they're usually tinkering with behaviors that have become automatic, and changing those behaviors requires careful supervision by the rider. The bigger the change you're suggesting, the more it will sap people's self-control. 1, 2. And when people exhaust their self-control, what they're exhausting are the mental muscles needed to think creatively, to focus, to inhibit their impulses, and to persist in the face of frustration or failure. In other words, they're exhausting precisely the mental muscles needed to make a big change. So, when you hear people say that change is hard because people are lazy or resistant, that's used wrong. In fact, the opposite is true: change is hard because people wear themselves out. And that's the second surprise about change: what looks like laziness is often exhaustion. 6. John Stegner believed the company he worked for, a large manufacturer, was wasting vast sums of money. "I thought we had an opportunity to drive down purchasing costs not by 2% but by something on the order of $1 billion over the next 5 years, said Stegner, who has quoted Ian John Carter and Dan Cohen's essential book The Heart of Change. To reap these savings, a big process shift would be required, and for that shift to occur, Stegner knew that he'd have to convince his bosses. He also knew that they'd never embrace such a big shift, unless they believed in the opportunity, and for the most part, they didn't. Seeking a compelling example of the company's poor purchasing habits, Stegner assigned a summer student intern to investigate a single-item work gloves, which workers in most of the company's factories wore. The student embarked on a mission to identify all the types of gloves used in all the company's factories and then trace back what the company was paying for them. The intrepid intern soon reported that the factories were 13 purchasing 424 different kinds of gloves. Furthermore, they were using different glove suppliers, and they were all negotiating their own prices. The same pair of gloves that cost $5 at one factory might cost $17 at another. At Stegner's request, the student collected a specimen of every one of the 424 different types of gloves and tagged each with the price paid. Then all the gloves were gathered up, brought to the boardroom, and piled up on the conference table. Stegner invited all the division presidents to come visit the glove shrine. He recalled the scene. What they saw was a large expensive table, normally clean or with a few papers, now stacked high with gloves. Each of our executives stared at this display for a minute. Then each said something like, "We really buy all these different kinds of gloves?" "Well, as a matter of fact, yes we do." "Really?" "Yes, really." Then they walked around the table. They could see the prices. They looked at two gloves that seemed exactly alike, yet one was marked $3.22 and the other $10.5. 5. It's a rare event when these people don't have anything to say. But that day, they just stood with their mouths gaping. The gloves exhibit soon became a traveling roadshow, visiting dozens of plants. The reaction was visceral: "This is crazy. We're crazy. And we've got to make sure this stops happening." Soon Stegner had exactly the mandate for change that he'd sought. The company changed its purchasing process, and saved a great deal of money. This was exactly the happy ending everyone wanted except, of course, for the glove salesman, who'd managed to sell the $5 gloves for $17. Let's be honest, most of us would not have tried what Stegner did. It would have been so easy, so natural, to make a presentation that spoke only to the writer. Think of the possibilities, the spreadsheets, the savings data, the cost-cutting protocols, the recommendations for supplier consolidation, the exquisite logic for central purchasing. You could have created a 12-tab Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that would have made a tax accountant weep with joy. But instead of doing any of that, Stegner dumped a bunch of gloves on a table and invited his bosses to see them. If there's such a thing as white-collar courage, surely this was an instance. Stegner knew that if things were going to change, he had to get his colleagues' elephants on his side. If he had made an analytical appeal, he probably would have gotten some supportive nods, and the execs might have requested a follow-up meeting 6 weeks later and then rescheduled it. The analytical case was compelling by itself. It might have convinced Stegner's colleagues that overhauling the purchasing system will be an important thing to do. Next year. Remember that if you reach your colleagues' riders but not their elephants, they will have direction without motivation. Maybe their riders will drag the elephant down the road for a while, but as we've seen, that effort can't last long. Once you break through to feeling, though, things change. Stegner delivered a jolt to his colleagues. First, they thought to themselves, we're crazy. Then they thought, we can fix this. Everyone could think of a few things to try to fix their glove problem and by extension the ordering process as a whole. That got their elephants fired up to move. We don't expect potential billion-dollar change stories to come dressed up like this. The change effort was led by a single employee. 5 with the able help of a summer intern. IT focused on a single product. The scope of the presentation didn't correspond in any way to the scope of the proposal. Yet Stegner's strategy worked. That's the power of speaking to both the rider and the elephant. 8. It's true that a motivated elephant can doom a change effort, but let's not forget that the rider has his own issues. He's a navel-gazer, an analyzer, a wheel spinner. If the rider isn't sure exactly what direction to go, he tends to lead the elephant in circles. And as we'll see, the tendency explains the third and final surprise about change. What looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. Two health researchers, Steve Booth Butterfield and Bill Rieger, professors at West Virginia University, were contemplating ways to persuade people to eat a healthier diet. From past research, they knew that people were more likely to change when the new behavior expected of them was crystal clear, but unfortunately, eating a healthier diet was anything but. Where to begin? Which foods should people stop or start eating? Shouldn't they change their eating behavior at breakfast, lunch, or dinner? At home or in restaurants? The number of ways to eat healthier is limitless, especially given the starting place of the average American diet. This is exactly the kind of situation in which the rider will spin his wheels, analyzing and agonizing and never moving forward. As the two researchers brainstormed, their thoughts kept coming back to milk. Most Americans drink milk, and we all know that milk is a great source of calcium. But milk is also the single largest source of saturated fat in the typical American's diet. In fact, calculations showed something remarkable. If Americans 1-6 switched from whole milk to skim or 1% milk, the average diet would immediately attain the USDA recommended levels of saturated fat. How do you get Americans to start drinking low-fat milk? You make sure it shows up in their refrigerators. And that isn't an entirely facetious answer. People will drink whatever is around the house. A family will plow through low-fat milk as fast as whole milk. So, in essence, the problem was even easier than anticipated. You don't need to change drinking behavior. You need to change purchasing behavior. Suddenly the intervention became razor sharp. What behavior do we want to change? We want consumers to buy skim or 1% milk. When? When they're shopping for groceries. Where? What else needs to change? Nothing for now. Rieger and Booth Butterfield launched a campaign in 2 communities in West Virginia, running spots on the local media outlets TV, newspaper, radio for 2 weeks. In contrast to the bland messages of most public health campaigns, the 1% milk campaign was punchy and specific. One ad trumpeted the fact that 1 glass of whole milk has the same amount of saturated fat as 5 strips of bacon. At a press conference, the researchers showed local reporters a tube full of fat, the equivalent of the amount found in a half-gallon of whole milk. Notice the elephant appeals. They're going for an "oh, gross" reaction. Rieger and Booth Butterfield monitored milk sales data at all 8 stores in the intervention area. Before the campaign, the market share of low-fat milk was 8%. After the campaign, it was 41%. 6 months later, it held at 35%. This brings us to the final part of the pattern that characterizes successful changes. If you want people to change, you must provide crystal clear direction. By now, you can understand the reason this is so important. 17. It's so the rider doesn't spin his wheels. If you tell people to act healthier, think of how many ways they can interpret that. Imagine their riders contemplating the options endlessly. Do I eat more grains and less meat? Or vice versa? Do I start taking vitamins? Would it be a good trade-off if exercise more and bribe myself with ice cream? Should I switch to Diet Coke, or is the artificial sweetener worse than the calories? What looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. Before this study, we might have looked at these West Virginians and concluded they were the kind of people who don't care about their health. But if they were indeed that kind of people, why was it so easy to shift their behavior? If you want people to change, you don't ask them to act healthier. You say, next time you're in the dairy aisle of the grocery store, reach for a jug of 1% milk instead of whole milk. 9. Now you've had a glimpse of the basic 3-part framework we will unpack in this book. 1. That can guide you in any situation where you need to change behavior. Direct the rider. What looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. So provide crystal clear direction. Think 1% milk. Motivate the elephant. What looks like laziness is often exhaustion. The rider can't GT his way by force for very long. So it's critical that you engage people's emotional side, get their elephants on the path, and cooperative. Think of the cookies and radishes study and the boardroom conference table full of gloves. 1. 8. Shape the path. What looks like a people problem is often a situation problem. We call the situation, including the surrounding environment, the path. When you shape the path, you make change more likely, no matter what's happening with the rider and elephant. Think of the effect of shrinking movie popcorn buckets. We created this framework to be useful for people who don't have scans of authority or resources. Some people can get their way by fiat. CEOs, for instance, can sell off divisions, hire people, fire people, change incentive systems, merge teams, and so on. Politicians can pass laws or impose punishments to change behavior. The rest of us don't have these tools, though. Admittedly, they would make life easier. Son, if you don't take out the trash tonight, you are fired. In this book, we don't talk a lot about these structural methods. As helpful as we hope this framework will be to you, we are well aware, and you should be, too, that this framework is no panacea. For one thing, it's incomplete. We've deliberately left out lots of great thinking on change in the interests of creating a framework that's simple enough to be practical. For another, there's a good reason why change can be difficult. The world doesn't always want what you want. You want to change how others are acting, but they get a vote. You can cajole, influence, inspire, and motivate, but sometimes an employee would rather lose his job than move out of his comfortable routines. Sometimes the alcoholic will want another drink no matter what the consequences. So we don't promise that we are going to make change easy, but at least we can make it easier. Our goal is to teach you a framework, based on decades of scientific research, that is simple enough to remember and flexible enough to use in many different situations: family, work, community, and otherwise. THREE5URPRJ5E5ABOUTEH and 9E19 to change behavior, you've got to direct the rider, motivate the elephant, and shape the path. If you can do all three at once, dramatic change can happen, even if you don't have lots of power or resources behind you. For proof of that, we don't need to look beyond Donald Berwick, a man who changed the face of healthcare. 1. 0. In 2004, Donald Berwick, a doctor and the CEO of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement (IHI), had some ideas about how to save lives, massive numbers of lives. Researchers at the IHI had analyzed patient care with the kinds of analytical tools used to assess the quality of cars coming off a production line. They discovered that the defect rate in healthcare was as high as 1 in 10, meaning, for example, that 10% of patients did not receive their antibiotics in the specified time. This was a shockingly high defect rate. Many other industries had managed to achieve performance at levels of 1 error in 1 cases and often far better. Berwick knew that the high medical defect rate meant that tens of thousands of patients were dying every year, unnecessarily. Berwick's insight was that hospitals could benefit from the same kinds of rigorous process improvements that had worked in other industries. Couldn't a transplant operation be produced as consistently and flawlessly as a Toyota Camry? Berwick's ideas were so well supported by research that they were essentially indisputable, yet little was happening. He certainly had no ability to force any changes on the industry. IHI had only 75 employees. But Berwick wasn't deterred. On December 14, 2004, he gave a speech to a room full of 20 THREE5URPRJ5E5ABOUTEH and 9E hospitals administrators at a large industry convention. He said, "Here is what I think we should do. I think we should save 100,000 lives. And I think we should do that by June 14, 18 months from today. Some is not a number, soon is not a time. Here's the number, 100,000. Here's the time, June 14, 209 a.m. The crowd was astonished. Their goal was daunting. But Berwick was quite serious about his intentions. He and his tiny team set out to do the impossible. IHI proposed 6 very specific interventions to save lives. For instance, one asked hospitals to adopt a set of proven procedures for managing patients on ventilators to prevent them from getting pneumonia, a common cause of unnecessary death. One of the procedures called for a patient's head to be elevated between 30 and 45 degrees so that oral secretions couldn't get into the windpipe. Of course, all hospitals administrators agreed with the goal to save lives, but the road to that goal was filled with obstacles. For one thing, for a hospital to reduce its defect rate, it had to acknowledge having a defect rate. In other words, it had to admit that some patients were dying needless deaths. Hospital lawyers were not keen to put this admission on record. Berwick knew he had to address the hospital's squeamishness about admitting error. At his December 14th speech, he was joined by the mother of a girl who'd been killed by a medical error. She said, "I'm a little speechless, and I'm a little sad, because I know that if this campaign had been in place 4 or 5 years ago, that Josie would be fine. But I'm happy, I'm thrilled to be part of this, because I know you can do it, because you have to do it." Another guest on stage, the chair of the North Carolina State Hospital Association, said, "An awful lot of people for a long time. 21 have had their heads in the sand on this issue, and it's time to do the right thing. It's as simple as that." IHI made joining the campaign easy. It required only a one-page form signed by a hospital CEO. By 2 months after Berwick's speech, over 1,000 hospitals had enrolled. Once a hospital enrolled, the IHI team helped the hospital embrace the new interventions. Team members provided research, step-by-step instruction guides, and training. They arranged conference calls for hospital leaders to share their victories and struggles with one another. They encouraged hospitals with early successes to become mentors to hospitals just joining the campaign. The friction in the system was substantial. Adopting the HI interventions required hospitals to overcome decades worth of habits and routines. Many doctors were irritated by the new procedures, which they perceived as constricting. But the adopting hospitals were seeing dramatic results, and their visible successes attracted more hospitals to join the campaign. 18 months later, at the exact moment he promised to return June 14, 2006, at 9 a.m. Berwick took the stage again to announce the results. Hospitals enrolled in the 100,000 Lives campaign have collectively prevented an estimated 122,300 avoidable deaths and, as importantly, have begun to institutionalize new standards of care that will continue to save lives and improve health outcomes into the future. The crowd was euphoric. Don Berwick, with his 75-person team at IHI, had convinced thousands of hospitals to change their behavior, and collectively, they'd saved 122,300 lives, the equivalent of throwing a life preserver to every man, woman, and child in Ann Arbor, Michigan. This outcome was the fulfillment of the vision Berwick had articulated, as he closed his speech 18 months earlier, about how the world would look when hospitals achieved the 1,000,000 lives goal, and, we will celebrate. Starting with pizza, and ending with champagne. We will celebrate the importance of what we have undertaken to do, the courage of honesty, the joy of companionship, the cleverness of a field operation, and the results we will achieve. We will celebrate ourselves, because the patients, whose lives we saved cannot join us, because their names can never be known. Our contribution will be what did not happen to them. And, though they are unknown, we will know that mothers and fathers are at graduations and weddings they would have missed, and that grandchildren will know grandparents they might never have known, and holidays will be taken, and work completed, and books read, and symphonies heard, and gardens tended that, without our work, would have been only beds of weeds. 1. Big changes can happen. Don Berwick and his team catalyzed a change that saved 1,000,000 lives, yet Berwick himself wielded no power. He couldn't change the law. He couldn't fire hospital leaders who didn't agree with him. He couldn't pay bonuses to hospitals that accepted his proposals. Berwick had the same tools the rest of us have. First, he directed his audience's riders. The destination was crystal clear: some is not a number, soon is not a time. Here's the number, 1,000,000. Here's the time, June 1, 2006 9 a.m. But that wasn't enough. He had to help hospitals figure out how to get there, and he couldn't simply say, try harder. Remember Act Healthier versus Buy 1% milk. So he proposed 6 specific interventions, such as elevating the heads of patients on ventilators, that were known to save lives. By staying laser-focused on these 6 interventions, Berwick made sure not to exhaust the riders of his audience with endless behavioral changes. Second, he motivated his audience's elephants. He made them feel the need for change. Many of the people in the audience already knew the facts, but knowing was not enough. Remember, knowing wasn't enough for executives at John Stegner's company. It took a stack of gloves to get their elephants engaged. Berwick had to get beyond knowing, so he brought his audience face to face with the mother of the girl who'd been killed by a medical error. I know that if this campaign had been in place 4 or 5 years ago, that Josie would be fine. Berwick was also careful to motivate the people who hadn't been in the room for his presentation. He didn't challenge people to overhaul medicine or bring TQM to healthcare. He challenged them to save 1,000,000 lives. That speaks to anyone's elephant. Third, he shaped the path. He made it easier for the hospitals to embrace the change. Think of the one-page enrollment form, the step-by-step instructions, the training, the support groups, the mentors. He was designing an environment that made it more likely for hospitals administrators to reform. Berwick also knew that behavior was contagious. He used peer pressure to persuade hospitals to join the campaign. Your rival hospital across town just signed on to help save 100,000 lives. Do you really want them to have the moral high ground? He also connected people. He matched up people who were struggling to implement the changes with people who had mastered them, almost like the mentors found in Alcoholics Anonymous. Berwick was creating a support group for healthcare reform. In this book, you'll learn about people like Berwick, who created sweeping change despite having few resources and little structural authority. You'll learn about an entrepreneur who saved his small company by turning his skeptical employees into customer service zealots, a student fresh out of college who saved an endangered species from extinction, a manager who plotted a way to get his colleague to stop acting like a jerk, and a therapist who reformed a group of child abusers. Whether the switch you seek is in your family, in your charity, in your organization, or in society at large, you'll get there by making 3 things happen. You'll direct the rider, motivate the elephant, and shape the path. Direct the rider. Direct the rider. Chapter 21. Find the bright spots. 1. In 1990, Jerry Sternin was working for Save the Children, the international organization that helps children in need. He'd been asked to open a new office in Vietnam. The government had invited Save the Children into the country to fight malnutrition. But when Sternin arrived, the welcome was rather chilly. The foreign minister let him know that not everyone in the government appreciated his presence. The minister told Sternin, "You have 6 months to make a difference." Sternin was traveling with his wife and 10-year-old son. None of them spoke Vietnamese. "We were like orphans at the airport when we arrived in Vietnam," he recalled. "We had no idea what we were going to do." Sternin had minimal staff and meager resources. Sternin had read as much as he could about the malnutrition problem. The conventional wisdom was that malnutrition 28 was the result of an intertwined set of problems. Sanitation was poor. Poverty was nearly universal. Clean water was not readily available. The rural people tended to be ignorant about nutrition. In Sternin's judgment, all of this analysis was TBU true but useless. Millions of kids can't wait for those issues to be addressed, he said. If addressing malnutrition required ending poverty and purifying water and building sanitation systems, then it would never happen. Especially in 6 months, with almost no money to spend. Sternin had a better idea. He traveled to rural villages and met with groups of local mothers. The mothers divided into teams and went out to weigh and measure every child in their village. They then pored over the results together. Sternin asked them, "Did you find any very, very poor kids who are bigger and healthier than the typical child?" The women, scanning the data, nodded and said, "Company, co. Yes, yes, yes." Sternin said, "You mean it's possible today in this village for a very poor family to have a well-nourished child?" Company, co. Then let's go see what they're doing. Sternin's strategy was to search the community for bright spots or successful efforts worth emulating. If some kids were healthy despite their disadvantages, that meant malnourishment was not inevitable. Furthermore, the mere existence of healthy kids provided hope for a practical, short-term solution. Sternin knew he couldn't fix the thorny root causes. But if a handful of kids were staying healthy against the odds, why couldn't every kid be healthy? Notice that Sternin was trying to focus the mother's riders. The overall topic, what can you do to make your child healthier, is simply too big and loaded to take on at once. The mothers needed direction, not motivation. After all, every mother's .29 elephant is going to be motivated to make her child healthier. But how? Remember the power of the 1% milk campaign, which made an abstract idea eat healthier practical. Sternin was saying, let's not sit around analyzing malnutrition. Let's go study what these bright spot mothers are doing. As a first step, Sternin and the mothers had to eliminate any bright spots who weren't typical. For example, a boy might have an uncle in the government who could send extra food his way. Other families wouldn't be able to replicate that. In order to recognize what the bright spot mothers were doing differently, the group had to synthesize the conventional wisdom about feeding kids. So they talked to dozens of people, mothers, fathers, older brothers and sisters, grandparents, and discovered that the community norms were pretty clear. Kids ate twice a day along with the rest of their families. They ate food that was appropriate for kids, soft, pure foods like the highest quality rice. Armed with an understanding of the norms, Sternin and their mothers went into the homes of the bright spot kids and observed the way the homes were run, alert for any deviations. Their observation yielded some unexpected insights. For one thing, bright spot moms were feeding their kids 4 meals a day using the same amount of food as other moms but spreading it across 4 servings rather than 2. The larger twice-a-day meals eaten by most families turned out to be a mistake for children because their malnourished stomachs couldn't process that much food at one time. The style of eating was also different. Most parents believed that their kids understood their own needs and would feed themselves appropriately from the communal bowl. But the healthy kids were fed more actively, hand-fed by parents if necessary. 30. They were even encouraged to eat when they were sick, which was not the norm. Perhaps most interesting, the healthy kids were eating different kinds of food. The bright spot mothers were collecting tiny shrimp and crabs from the rice paddies and mixing them in with their kids' rice. Shrimp and crabs were eaten by adults but generally weren't considered appropriate food for kids. The mothers also tossed in sweet potato greens, which were considered a low-class food. These dietary improvisations, however strange or low-class, were doing something precious, adding sorely needed protein and vitamins to the children's diet. As an outsider, Sternin never could have foreseen these practices. He knew nothing about sweet potato greens. The solution was a native one, emerging from the real-world experience of the villagers, and for that reason it was inherently realistic and inherently sustainable. But knowing the solution wasn't enough. For anything to change, lots of mothers needed to adopt the new cooking habits. Most people in Sternin's situation would have been itching to make an announcement, to call the village together and unveil a set of recommendations. Gather around, everyone, I've studied your problem and now I have the answer. Here are Sternin's 5 rules for fighting malnutrition. But Sternin refused to make a formal announcement. Knowledge does not change behavior, he said. We have all encountered crazy shrinks and obese doctors and divorced marriage counselors. He knew that telling the mothers about nutrition wouldn't change their behavior. They'd have to practice it. The community designed a program in which 50 malnourished families, in groups of 10, would meet at a hut each day and prepare food. The families were required to bring shrimp, crabs, and sweet potato greens. The mothers washed their hands. 3, 1 with soap and cooked the meal together. Sternin said that the moms were acting their way into a new way of thinking. Most important, it was their change, something that arose from the local wisdom of the village. Sternin's role was only to help them see that they could do it, that they could conquer malnutrition on their own. By organizing these cooking groups, Sternin was addressing both the rider and the elephant. The mother's riders got highly specific instructions, here's how to cook a tasty lunch with shrimp and sweet potato greens. And their elephants got a feeling, hope. There really is a way to make my daughter healthier. And it's not very hard, it's something one can do. Notice that the path played a role, too. And so many of the mothers were doing something, there was strong social pressure to go along. The cooking classes, in effect, were changing the culture of the village. Best of all, bright spot solved the not invented here problem. Some people have a knee-jerk skeptical response to imported solutions. Imagine the public outcry if an American politician proposed that the United States adopt the French healthcare system. Or vice versa. We all think our group is the smartest. By looking for bright spots within the very village he was trying to change, Sternin ensured that the solution would be a native one. He would have faced a much more difficult quest if he'd brought in a plan from a different village. The local mothers would have bristled, those people aren't like us. Our situation is more complicated than that. Those ideas wouldn't work here. Finding bright spots, then, solves many different problems at once. That's no surprise. Successful change efforts involve connecting all three parts of the framework: rider, elephant, and path. Although in this book we explain one part of the framework at a time, we'll continue to remind you that even in 32 example in the rider chapters will influence the elephant and path. Concepts are rarely exclusive. 6 months after Sternin had come to the Vietnamese village, 65% of the kids were better nourished and stayed that way. Later, when researchers from Emory University's School of Public Health came to Vietnam to gather independent data, they found that even children who hadn't been born when Sternin left the villages were as healthy as the kids Sternin had reached directly. The discovery provided proof that the changes had stuck. Sternin's success began to spread. We took the first 14 villages in different phases of the program and turned them into a social laboratory. People who wanted to replicate the nutrition model came from different parts of Vietnam. Every day, they would go to this living university, to these villages, touching, smelling, sniffing, watching, listening. They would graduate, go to their villages, and implement the process until they got it right. The program reached 2.2 million Vietnamese people in 265 villages. Our living university has become a national model for teaching villagers to reduce drastically malnutrition in Vietnam, Sternin said. Stories don't come much more heroic than this. Sternin and his small team of believers, working with a shoestring budget, managed to make a big dent in malnutrition. What makes it more remarkable is that they weren't experts. They didn't walk in with the answers. All they had was a deep faith in the power of bright spots. 2. The rider part of our minds has many strengths. The rider is a thinker and a planner, and can plot a course for a better future. But as we've seen, the rider has a terrible weakness: the tendency to spin his wheels. The rider loves to contemplate and analyze, and, making matters worse, his analysis is almost always .33. Directed at problems rather than at bright spots. You can probably recall a conversation with a friend who agonized for hours over a particular relationship problem. But can you remember an instance when a friend spent even a few minutes analyzing why something was working so well? These analytical qualities can be extremely helpful. Obviously, many problems get solved through analysis, but in situations where change is needed, too much analysis can doom the effort. The rider will see too many problems and spend too much time sizing them up. Look again at Jerry Sternin in the Vietnam story. Dozens of experts had analyzed the situation in Vietnam. Their riders had agonized over the problems: the water supply, the sanitation, the poverty, the ignorance. They'd written position papers and research documents and development plans. But they hadn't changed a thing. In tough times, the rider sees problems everywhere, and analysis paralysis often kicks in. The rider will spin his wheels indefinitely unless he's given clear direction. That's why to make progress on a change, you need ways to direct the rider. Show him where to go, how to act, what destination to pursue. And that's why bright spots are so essential, because they are your best hope for directing the rider when you're trying to bring about change. 3. School stinks, said Bobby, a 9th grader, who Jay used reported for his first school counseling session. John J. Murphy, the school psychologist, was surprised Bobby had shown up at all. Several teachers had referred Bobby for counseling, frustrated by his bad behavior. He was constantly late, rarely did his work, was disruptive in class, and sometimes made loud threats to other kids in the hallways. 34. Bobby's home life was just as chaotic. He'd been shuffled in and out of foster homes and special facilities for kids with behavioral problems. He and his father were on the waiting list for family counseling. The local social service agency in Covington, Kentucky, was keeping tabs on Bobby. By the time he showed up for his session with Murphy, he was in danger of being placed in another special facility because of his problems at school. Murphy was almost powerless in this situation. The counselor had no way to improve Bobby's situation at home, and time was working against him at best. He'd see Bobby for an hour here, an hour there. Murphy couldn't reward Bobby if he behaved well, or punish him if he behaved poorly. Not that punishment would have worked. Bobby usually ended up in the principal's office by mid-morning for disciplinary issues, but his behavior never changed. Ignoring the school stinks comment, Murphy began talking to Bobby and posed a series of unusual questions. So began the first of a handful of conversations between Murphy and Bobby. Now, fast forward to 3 months later, a dramatic change had occurred. The number of days Bobby was sent to the principal's office had declined by 80%. Bobby hadn't become an Eagle Scout, mind you, but the improvement was strong enough to keep social services from having to transfer him to the school for troubled kids. Bobby, a chronic offender, had become an occasional offender. And it happened because of a few hours of talking with a counselor. What, exactly, happened in those conversations? 4. John Murphy is a practitioner of solutions-focused brief therapy, solutions-focused therapy for short. Solutions-focused therapy .35 was invented in the late 1970s by a husband and wife therapist team, Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kimberg, and their colleagues at the Brief Family Therapy Center in Milwaukee. Solutions-focused therapy is radically different from traditional therapy. In classical psychotherapy, think Tony Soprano and Dr. Melfi, you and your therapist explore your problem. What are its roots? Does it trace back to something in your childhood? There's a sense of archaeological excavation. You're digging around your mind for a buried nugget of insight, something that may explain why you behave the way you do. Excavating the past takes time. A standard Freudian psychoanalysis might take 5 years of work, with sessions once or twice a week. And after 5 years and $50,000, you discover it's all your mom's fault. Solutions-focused therapists, in contrast, couldn't care less about archaeology. They don't dig around for clues about why you act the way you do. They don't care about your childhood. All they care about is the solution to the problem at hand. Marriage therapist Michelle Weiner Davis was initially trained as a classical psychoanalyst. Like all psychoanalysts, she believed that childhood experiences created unresolved traumas that fed current problems, and she tried to help her clients understand how their upbringing had shaped their behavior in relationships. But she was often unhappy with the outcomes her clients achieved through psychoanalysis. In her book Divorce Busting, she explained why my clients would frequently plead, "Now I see that we are reenacting our parents' marriages, but what do we do about it? We can't stop fighting." She learned that understanding a problem doesn't necessarily solve it, that knowing is not enough. Weiner Davis was initially skeptical about solutions-focused brief therapy. It seemed too simple. Most people, including most therapists, believe the change process has to be complicated, 36, and arduous. No pain, no gain is the general rule of thumb. To describe how her thinking about solutions-focused therapy changed, she used an analogy from Billy. At one point, her golf swing started misfiring, so she went to a golf pro, thinking her technique needed a major overhaul. She noted that the golf pro didn't do any archaeology. He never said, "You obviously have a fear of winning. Did your father intimidate you as a little girl?" Instead, all he did was suggest a minor modification, relaxing her tight grip on the club. At first, she was a little peeved by this advice. It didn't seem profound enough to justify his fee. But later, on the course, her balls were going straighter and farther. Maybe small adjustments can work after all, she thought. 5. Solutions-focused therapists use a common set of techniques for discovering potential solutions. Early in the first session, after hearing the patient explain his or her problem, the therapist poses the miracle question. "Can I ask you a sort of strange question? Suppose that you go to bed tonight and sleep well. Sometime, in the middle of the night, while you are sleeping, a miracle happens and all the troubles that brought you here are resolved. When you wake up in the morning, what's the first small sign you'd see that would make you think, well, something must have happened, the problem is gone?" Here's how one couple in marital therapy answered the miracle question posed by their therapist. Brian Cade of Sydney, Australia. "Wife, I'd be happy, feeling at ease at last. I'd be more pleasant to Bob, not jumping down his throat all the time." 37 Cade, "What will you do instead?" Wife, "Well, there would be more understanding between us. We'd listen to what each other was saying." HUS Bandy, "Yes. The moment, we don't really listen to each other. We just can't wait to get our own point in." Cade, "How could you tell that the other was really listening?" Wife, "In the face, I think. We'd perhaps make more eye contact. Pauses, then laughs. We'd nod in the right places." HUSBAND, "Yes. We'd both respond to what the other was saying rather than just attacking or ignoring it." Notice that Cade prods the couple for specifics. What will you do instead? How could you tell the other person was really listening? The miracle question doesn't ask you to describe the miracle itself, it asks you to identify the tangible signs that the miracle happened. Here's another example from a therapist's session with a man with a drinking problem. "Fa miracle solve your drinking problem, what would you be doing differently the next morning?" "I don't know, I can't imagine." "Try." "Well, all my friends drink, so what do you expect me to do?" "I know it's not easy, but think about it." "Well, there are all sorts of things." "Name one." "Maybe I would go to the library and look at the newspapers." How would your day be different if you went to the library? Solutions-focused therapists learn to focus their patients on the first hints of the miracle dash. What's the first small sign you'd see that would make you think the problem was gone? Because 38. They want to avoid answers that are overly grand and unattainable. "My bank account is full, I love my job, and my marriage is great." Once they've helped patients identify specific and vivid signs of progress, they pivot to a second question, which is perhaps even more important. It's the exception question. When was the last time you saw a little bit of a miracle, even just for a short time? An alcoholic would be asked, "When was the last time you stayed sober for an hour or two?" Or the wife in the dialogue quoted above would be asked, "When was the last time you felt like your husband was truly listening to you?" It's an ingenious tactic. What the therapist is trying to demonstrate, in a subtle way, is that the client is capable of solving her own problem. As a matter of fact, the client is offering up proof that she's already solved it, at least in some circumstances. For instance, Brian Cade worked with a mother whose children were out of control. He asked her the exception question, "What was different about the last time your kids obeyed you? In what circumstances do they seem to behave better?" After a pause, "I guess it's when they realize they have pushed me too far." Cade, "How could they tell that?" It's funny. I think it's when I stop ranting and raving at them and my voice goes very, very calm. I think I'm able to do that when I feel generally less harassed, when I feel I've got things done rather than spent the whole day worrying about getting things done. When I feel I've not been able to get on top of the housework, I tend to panic." FINDTHEBRIGHTSPOTS. Cade asks her what the kids might notice on good days. I think I just look calmer." Cade, "What else?" I probably greet them more enthusiastically and smile more." 39 Solutions-focused therapists believe that there are exceptions to every problem and that those exceptions, once identified, can be carefully analyzed, like the game film of a sporting event. Let's replay that scene, where things was working for you. What was happening? How did you behave? Were you smiling? Did you make eye contact? And that analysis can point directly toward a solution that is, by definition, workable. After all, it worked before. These exceptions are just like Jerry Sternham's bright spots. Just as there were some kids in the Vietnamese village who managed to stay healthy despite the poverty, there are some moments in an alcoholic's life when he is sober despite the cravings. Those bright spots are gold to be mined. Notice again that bright spots provide not only direction for the rider but hope and motivation for the elephant. What does this mean for you? You may not fight malnutrition, and you may not need therapy. But if you're trying to change things, there are going to be bright spots in your field of view, and if you learn to recognize them and understand them, you will solve one of the fundamental mysteries of change. What, exactly, needs to be done differently? Suppose you're a human relations manager, and you've been encouraging line managers to give feedback to their employees more frequently, rather than storing it up for their once-a-year performance reviews. You hosted an off-site training program for 10 managers so they could practice the recommended new style 40. Off-in-the-moment feedback, and they all left the program pledging to experiment with it. After 4 weeks, you start to hear back from some of the managers, and their results have been mixed. 2 of the managers seem genuinely transformed, excited about the way the faster feedback has improved their relationships with team members. 5 of the managers are weakly positive, saying they tried it a few times. 2 of the managers say, regretfully, that they've been too busy to try. 1 is an outright skeptic, and thinks the whole initiative is hogwash. What now? The bright spots give you an action plan. Go investigate the 2 successful managers. First, see if either situation is an anomaly. For instance, in your follow-up, you might discover that one of the successful managers had not been giving any more feedback to his team and he'd simply been approaching individuals more often, to make small talk. The extra social contact made him feel good but annoyed team members who were constantly interrupted. That manager is not a real bright spot. The other success might be legitimate. Maybe the manager, Debbie, devised a tracking sheet that reminds her to provide feedback to every employee every week. Maybe she set a goal for herself that her quick feedback will never last longer than 2 minutes, and will apply only to a specific project. It won't be a referendum on an employee's overall performance. Maybe she set up open-door office hours so that employees can drop by for quick feedback on ongoing projects. Now that you've defined your bright spot, you can try to clone it. Have the other managers spend an hour or 2 shadowing Debbie, seeing firsthand how she incorporated the new style into her workday. Get Debbie to attend your next off-site training program so she can coach other managers on the mechanics of quick .41 feedback. Talk to it and see if there's a way to roll out a more polished version of Debbie's impromptu tracking sheet. Bottom line, you are spending 80% of your time exploring Debbie's success and finding ways to replicate it. You aren't obsessing about the manager who was skeptical. You aren't planning another training program with the same managers to review the material. You are simply asking yourself, what's working and how can we do more of it? That's the bright spot philosophy in a single question. 6. Focusing on bright spots can be counterintuitive for businesses. Richard Pascal, one of Jerry Sterning's collaborators, discovered this in 2003, when he accepted a consulting assignment with Genentech. The company had recently launched a drug called Xolair, which had been regarded as a miracle drug for asthma. It had proved effective in preventing asthma attacks for many patients. Yet 6 months after launch, sales of Xolair remained well below expectations. Pascal and his team were asked to help figure out why Xolair was underperforming. They immediately started looking for bright spots and soon found one. 2 saleswomen who worked the Dallas-Fort Worth area were selling 20 times more Xolair than their peers. Further investigation revealed that the women were using a fundamentally different kind of sales pitch. Rather than selling the health benefits of the drug, which doctors largely understood, they were helping doctors understand how to administer the drug. Xolair was not a pill or an inhaler, it required infusion via an intravenous drip. This technique was unfamiliar and therefore elephant-spooking to the allergists and pediatricians, who would be prescribing the drug. 42. Here was a classic bright spot situation. Like the Vietnamese mothers, who mixed sweet potato greens into their kids' rice, these saleswomen were achieving radically different results with the same set of resources everyone else had. Having discovered the bright spot, Genentech's managers could help spread the innovation across their entire sales force. But that didn't happen. And here's where a cautionary tale intrudes on our success story. What actually happened was this: the superior results of the Dallas-Fort Worth reps were viewed with suspicion. Managers speculated that the saleswomen had an unfair advantage, and their initial assumption was that the pair's sales territories or quotas needed to be revisited. Later investigation established that the 2 women had the same type of client base as the other reps. To be fair to the Genentech managers, let's acknowledge that there was indeed a chance that those 2 reps were simply an anomaly. But the manager's first reaction to the good news was that it must be bad news. That reaction is a good reminder that the rider's capacity for analysis is endless. Even successes can look like problems to an overactive rider. 7. Let's circle back to Bobby, the troubled student, because now we can start to understand his rather abrupt transformation. Here's a brief exchange from one of Bobby's counseling sessions. Notice how Murphy, the school counselor, starts by popping the exception question, MURPHY, tell me about the times at school when you don't get in trouble as much. Point 43 BOB. I never get in trouble. Well, not a lot, in Miss Smith's class. MURPHY, what's different about Miss Smith's class? BOB. I don't know, she's nicer. We get along great. MURPHY, what exactly does she do that's nicer? Murphy wasn't content with Bobby's vague conclusion that Ms. Smith is nicer. He kept probing until Bobby identified several things about Miss Smith and her class that seemed to help him behave well. For instance, Miss Smith always greeted him as soon as he walked into class. Other teachers, understandably, avoided him. She gave him easier work, which she knew he could complete. Bobby has a learning disability. And whenever the class started working on an assignment, she checked with Bobby to make sure he understood the instructions. Ms. Smith's class was a bright spot, and as we've seen, anytime you have a bright spot, your mission is to clone it. Using Ms. Smith's class as a model, Murphy gave Bobby's other teachers very practical tips about how to deal with him. Greet Bobby at the door. Make sure he's assigned work he can do. Check to make sure he understands the instructions. What Murphy had avoided, of course, was archaeology. He didn't dig into Bobby's troubled childhood, and he didn't try to excavate the sources of his anger and willfulness. For Murphy, all that information would have been TBU, as Sternin would say, true but useless. The other thing Murphy avoided was Jen and Tech's knee-jerk skepticism. The mental quibbles could have come so easily. Miss Smith is just a nicer person than the other teachers, or her class is easier, or teachers shouldn't have to adapt their approach to a problem student. Instead, Murphy found a bright spot, and he trusted it. Bobby's teachers were pleased when Murphy approached them with such specific guidance, and they promised to give his recommendations a try. Murphy asked the teachers to help him track whether the solutions were working by recording Bobby's performance on 3 metrics: 1 arriving to class on time, 2 completing assignments in class, and 3 behaving acceptably in class. Over the next 3 months, as reported earlier, Bobby's rate of being sent to the principal's office for a major infraction decreased by 80%. Bobby also made striking progress on day-to-day behavior, as measured by the 3 metrics. Before solutions-focused therapy, his teachers typically rated his performance as acceptable in only 1 or 2 out of 6 class periods per day. After solutions-focused therapy, he was rated as acceptable in 4 or 5 of the 6 periods. Bobby is still not a model student, but he's a lot better. 8. Notice something remarkable about both the Vietnam and the Bobby case studies. In each one, relatively small changes cooking with sweet potato greens, greeting Bobby at the door had a big impact on a big problem. There is a clear asymmetry between the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution. Big problem, small solution. This is a theme you will see again and again. Big problems are rarely solved with commensurately big solutions. Instead, they are most often solved by a sequence of small solutions, sometimes over weeks, sometimes over decades. And this asymmetry is why the writer's predilection for analysis can backfire so easily. When the writer analyzes a problem, he seeks a solution that befits the scale of it. If the writer spots a hole, he wants to fill it, and if he's got a round hole with a 24-inch diameter, he's gonna 0.45 go looking for a 24-inch peg. But the mental model is wrong. For instance, in analyzing malnutrition in Vietnam, the experts had exhaustively analyzed all the big systemic forces that were responsible for it: lack of sanitation, poverty, ignorance, lack of water. No doubt they also concocted big systemic plans to address those forces. But that was fantasy. No one, other than Sternin, thought to ask, what's working right now? In reviewing Bobby's situation at high school, the teachers and administrators whispered about all the things that were broken: broken home, learning disability, uncontrollable impulses. Any normal person, analyzing Bobby's situation, would have craved an intensive, complex solution to match the intensive, complex problem. But no one, other than the counselor Murphy, thought to ask, what's working right now? To pursue bright spots is to ask the question, what's working, and how can we do more of it? Sounds simple, doesn't it? Yet, in the real world, this obvious question is almost never asked. Instead, the question we ask is more problem-focused: what's broken, and how do we fix it? This problem-seeking mindset is a shortcoming of the writer in each of us. Psychologists who have studied this phenomenon or predilection for the negative have reached some fascinating conclusions. An illustration of what they found: take a look at the following words taken from a Learn English at Home website. They're all words for emotions. We've excerpted the first 24 of them from an alphabetical list. See if you notice any patterns: angry, annoyed, appalled, apprehensive, delighted, disappointed, ecstatic, excited. 46. Ashamed, emotional, bewildered, envious, betrayed, embarrassed, confused, furious, confident, frightened, cheated, great, cross, happy, depressed, horrified. Those are 24 of the most common emotion words in English, and only 6 of them are positive. In a more exhaustive study, a psychologist analyzed 558 emotion words, every one that he could find in the English language, and found that 62% of them were negative versus 38% positive. That's a pretty shocking discrepancy. According to an old urban legend, Eskimos have 100 different words for snow. Well, it turns out that negative emotions are our snow. This negative focus is not confined to emotions. Across the board, we seem wired to focus on the negative. A group of psychologists reviewed over 200 articles and concluded that, for a wide range of human behavior and perception, a general principle holds true: bad is stronger than good. Exhibit A: people who were shown photos of bad and good events spend longer viewing the bad ones. Exhibit B: when people learn bad stuff about someone else, it's stickier than good stuff. People pay closer attention to the bad stuff, reflect on it more, remember it longer, and weigh it more heavily in assessing the person overall. This pattern is so robust that researchers, who study how we perceive one another, have a label for it: positive-negative asymmetry. Exhibit C: a researcher reviewed 17 studies about how people interpret and explain events in their lives. For example, point 47. How sports fans interpret sporting events, or how students describe their days in their journals. Across multiple domains: work and politics and sports and personal life, people were more likely to spontaneously bring up an attempt to explain negative events than positive ones. We could present plenty more exhibits, but for now we'll give the study's authors the last disappointed word on the subject. When we began this review, we anticipated finding some exceptions that would demarcate the limits of the phenomena. But we were unable to locate any significant spheres in which good was consistently stronger than bad. Emphasis added. Bad is stronger than good. As Leslie Fiedler once said, lots of novelists have achieved their fame by focusing on marital problems, but there's never been a successful novel about a happy marriage. 9. A particular strain of this bad is stronger than good bias is critical when it comes to tackling change. Let's call it a problem focus. To see it, consider the situation. Your child comes home one day with her report card. She got 1 A, 4 Bs, and 1 F. Where will you spend your time as a parent? This hypothetical comes from author Marcus Buckingham, who says that nearly all parents will tend to fixate on F. It's easy to empathize with them. Something seems broken, we should fix it. Let's get her a tutor. Or maybe she should be punished, she's grounded until the grade recovers. It is the rare parent who would say, instead, honey, you made an N in this one class. You must really have a strength in this subject. How can we build on that? Buckingham has a fine series of books on making the most of your strengths rather than obsessing about your weaknesses. When the writer sees that things are going well, he doesn't 48. Think much about them. But when things break, he snaps to attention and starts applying his problem-solving skills. So when your kids are making nanoseconds and Bs, you don't think much about their grades. But when they make a 0 or an F, you spring into action. It's weird when you think about, isn't it? What if the writer had a more positive orientation? Imagine a world in which you experienced a rush of gratitude every single time you flipped a light switch and the room lit up. Imagine a world in which after a husband forgot his wife's birthday, she gave him a big kiss and said, for 13 of the last 14 years you remembered my birthday. That's wonderful. This is not our world. But in times of change, it needs to be. Our writer has a problem focus when he needs a solution focus. If you are a manager, ask yourself, what is the ratio of the time I spend solving problems to the time I spend scaling successes? We need to switch from archaeological problem solving to bright spot evangelizing. There's no question that it's possible to do. Take Jerry Sternin. He came into an environment riddled with failure. The opportunities for analysis were endless. He could have stayed in Vietnam for 20 years, writing position papers on the malnutrition problem. But what he knew was this, even in failure there is success. An alcoholic goes an hour without a drink. 3 sales reps out of 50 sell like crazy. A few Vietnamese mothers, with no more money than any others, manage to raise healthy kids. These flashes of success, these bright spots can illuminate the roadmap for action, and spark the hope that change is possible. End chapter. Chapter 3. Script the critical moves. 1. A doctor was asked to consider the medical records of a 67-year-old patient who had chronic hip pain from arthritis. In the past, the patient had been given drugs to treat his pain, but they had been ineffective, so the doctor was forced to consider a more drastic option, hip replacement surgery, which involves slicing open the thigh, wrenching the bone out of the socket, sawing off the arthritic end, and replacing it with an implant. Recovery from hip replacement surgery is long and painful. Then came an unexpected break in the case. A final check with the patient's pharmacy uncovered one medication that hadn't been tried. Now the doctor faced a dilemma. Should he prescribe the untried medication, even though other medications had failed, or should he go ahead and refer the patient for surgery? This dilemma, based on real medical cases, was created by physician Donald Riedelmeyer and psychologist Eldar Schaefer, who 50. Used it to study the way doctors make decisions. When doctors were presented with this case history, 47% of them chose to try the medication, in hopes of saving the patient from going under the knife. In a variation on the dilemma, another group of doctors were presented with almost exactly the same set of case facts, except this time, the patient's pharmacy discovered 2 untried medications. If you were the patient with the arthritic agent, you'd be thrilled. Certainly 2 non-surgical options are better than 1. But when the doctors were presented with 2 medications, only 28% chose to try either one. This doesn't make sense. The doctors were acting as though having more medication options somehow made medication a worse bet than surgery. But if 47% of doctors thought medication A was preferable to surgery, the mere existentia of a second medication shouldn't have tipped them toward surgery. What happened here is decision paralysis. More options, even good ones, can freeze us and make us retreat to the default plan, which in this case was a painful and invasive hip replacement surgery. This behavior clearly is not rational, but it is human. Decisions are the writer's turf, and because they require careful supervision and self-control, they tax the writer's strength. Remember the radish chocolate chip cookie study from Chapter 1. The more choices the writer is offered, the more exhausted the writer gets. Have you ever noticed that shopping is a lot more tiring than other kinds of light activity? Now you know why it's all those choices. This is important, because we encounter excess choice all around us. Consider 3 real examples of decision paralysis. Scene 1, a gourmet food store. The store managers have set up a table, where customers can sample imported jams for free. One day, the table showcases 6 different jams. Another day, S5, 24 jams. As you'd expect, the 24 jam display attracts more customers to stop by for a sample, but when it comes time to buy, they can't make a decision. Shoppers who saw only 6 jams on display are 10 times more likely to buy a jar of jam. Scene 2, the office. The employees of a large company read over their 401k materials, ready to start saving for retirement. The Human Resources Department has thoughtfully provided many investment options: domestic growth stock funds, domestic value stock funds, municipal bond funds, real estate investment trusts, emerging market funds, developed market funds, money market accounts, and more. Each category might have several choices within it. Really complete 401k plans might offer dozens of options. The extra options backfire, however, because for every 0 options offered, the employee's rate of participation goes down by 2%. Decision paralysis deters people from saving for their own retirement. And because many companies match employees' contributions, employees may also be walking away from free money. Scene 3: a local bar. It's speed dating. Singles meet a series of other singles one-on-one, spending perhaps 5 minutes with each person, in hopes of making a romantic connection. But decision paralysis thwarts even Cupid. Young adults who meet 8 other singles make more matches than those who meet 20. Bottom line, decision paralysis disrupts medical decisions and retail decisions and investment decisions and dating decisions. Let's go out on a limb and suggest that it might affect decisions in your job and life, too. Think about the sources of decision paralysis in your organization. Every business must choose among attractive options. Growing revenue quickly versus maximizing profitability. Making perfect products versus getting products to market faster. 52. Being innovative and creative versus optimizing efficiency. If you fold together lots of those tensions, you create a surefire recipe for paralysis. It took only 2 medications to fuzz the doctor's brains. How many options do your people have? Think about your local school board. Every year, the problems and solutions multiply. You can just imagine the mental conversation. Property tax revenue is falling, but the teachers need a 3% cost of living raise, and we can't forget about extracurriculars. Cutting the marching band last year was a killer, but we must continue to invest in our new science magnet school. If it doesn't work, there will be egg on our face. Yet it's ridiculous to consider any of this until we fix our crumbling infrastructure and address our overcrowded classrooms. For the frazzled school board member, it suddenly looks a lot more attractive to roll over last year's budget with a 1.5% increase on every line item. As Barry Schwartz puts it in his book The Paradox of Choice, as we face more and more options, we become overloaded. Choice no longer liberates, it debilitates. It might even be said to tyrannize. 2. The status quo feels comfortable and steady, because much of the choice has been squeezed out. You have your routines, your ways of doing things. For most of your day, the rider is on autopilot. But in times of change, autopilot doesn't work anymore, choices suddenly proliferate, and autopilot habits become unfamiliar decisions. When you're on a diet, the habitual daily trip for nachos Bell brand is disqualified, and in its place is left a decision. When you've got a new manager, the way you communicate stops being second nature, and starts being a choice. S53 change brings new choices that create uncertainty. Let's be clear, it's not only options that yield decision paralysis, like picking one donut from 100 flavors. Ambiguity does, too. In times of change, you may not know what options are available. And this uncertainty leads to decision paralysis as surely as a table with 24 jams. Ambiguity is exhausting to the rider, because the rider is tugging on the reins of the elephant, trying to direct the elephant down the new path. But when the road is uncertain, the elephant will insist on taking the default path, the most familiar path, just as the doctors did. Why? Because uncertainty makes the elephant anxious. Think of how, in an unfamiliar place, you gravitate toward a familiar face. And that's why decision paralysis can be deadly for change, because the most familiar path is always the status quo. Many leaders pride themselves on setting high-level direction. I'll set the vision and stay out of the details. It's true that a compelling vision is critical, as we'll see in the next chapter. But it's not enough. Big picture, hands-off leadership isn't likely to work in a change situation, because the hardest part of change, the paralyzing part, is precisely in the details. In Chapter 1, we explained why what looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. The citizens of 2 West Virginia communities, unhealthy in their eating habits, underwent a major change when a couple of professors coached them to buy 1% milk. They didn't need a big picture vision. No one needs convincing that eating healthy is an admirable goal. What they needed was someone who could bring a noble goal within the realm of everyday behavior, someone who could cut through the bewildering array of potentially healthy choices and suggest a good place to start. Ambiguity is the enemy. Any successful change requires a 54. Translation of ambiguous goals into concrete behaviors. In short, to make a swish, you need to script the critical moves. 3. In 1995, Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso decided to privatize Brazil's railroads. He split the system into 7 different branches, shades of Mabel, and auctioned off the rights to run them. Previous administrations had not invested much in the rail system, and at the time of the auction, it was a deteriorating mess. A study concluded that 50% of the network's bridges needed repair and 20% of them were on the verge of collapse. The technologies used in Brazil were far behind those in other developed countries. In fact, the rail system was still using 20 locomotives powered by steam engines. A private firm, GP Investimentos Limited, decided to bid for the branch known as the Southern Line, which ran through Brazil's 3 southernmost states. GP was high bidder in the auction in December 1, 1996. After an interim period of management, the firm put one of its own executives, Alexander Bering, in charge of the company, which was later renamed America Latina Logistica AL. When Bering took charge, he was in his early 30s, just 4 years out of business school. Bering didn't have much to work with. AL had only 30 million Brazilian reals in cash on its balance sheet. At one of Bering's first meetings, a mid-level manager beseeched him for 5 million reals to repair a single bridge. Though sympathetic, Bering knew that fixing everything that was broken would require hundreds of millions of reals. The needs were profound, but he faced an unyielding constraint: AL's depleted bank account. S55 The railroad purchased by GP was in chaos, and when Bering and his team took charge, with new personnel and new priorities, more chaos was whipped into the pre-existing chaos. The resulting decision paralysis should have been inescapable. And it likely would have been, if Bering hadn't made clear exactly what needed to be done. His top priority was to lift AL out of its precarious, cash-strapped financial state. To accomplish this, he and his 35-year-old CFO, Delio Calciolari, developed 4 rules to govern the company's investments. Rule 1. Money would be invested only in projects that would allow all to earn more revenue in the short term. Rule 2. The best solution to any problem was the one that would cost the least money up front, even if it ended up costing more in the long term, and even if it was a lower quality solution. Rule 3. Options that would fix a problem quickly were preferred to slower options that would provide superior long-term fixes. Rule 4. Reusing or recycling existing materials was better than acquiring new materials. The 4 rules were clear. 1. Unblock revenue. 2. Minimize upfront cash. 3. Faster is better than best. 4. Use what you've got. These rules, taken together, ensure that cash wouldn't be consumed unless it was being used as bait for more cash. Spend a little, make a little more. This is what we mean by scripting the critical moves. 56. Change begins at the level of individual decisions and behaviors, but that's a hard place to start because that's where the friction is. Inertia and decision paralysis will conspire to keep people doing things the old way. To spark movement in a new direction, you need to provide crystal clear guidance. That's why scripting is important. You've got to think about the specific behavior that you'd want to see in a tough moment, whether the tough moment takes place in a Brazilian railroad system or late at night in your own snack-loaded pantry. You can't script every move. That would be like trying to foresee the 17th move in a chess game. It's the critical moves that count. Recall that, in West Virginia, the researchers decided to focus their campaign on milk, because it was the source of the most saturated fat in the average diet. The researchers didn't offer suggestions about bread or soda or butter or potato chips. They scripted the critical move, switch to 1% milk. Similarly, Baring's 4 rules were focused on financial triage. He didn't have the luxury of long-term planning. He needed his people to move, immediately, in a new direction, in hopes that they could buy all enough time to make a fuller transformation. Notice that he didn't say a word about other important issues, such as employee morale or marketing or R&D. By staying focused on the critical moves, he made it easier for his people to change direction. In 1998, for instance, the company had to turn down business hauling grain because it didn't have enough locomotives. While its competitors were negotiating for new locomotives, ALL's engineers worked around the clock repairing old locomotives. Faster is better than best. Minimize upfront cash. Also, ALL's engineers figured out a way to boost the locomotive's fuel capacity so they could operate longer without refueling. This reduced downtime, allowing more routes per locomotive. 57. Just as Southwest Airlines gets more flights per plane than its competitors, because of its quick turnarounds at the gate. Unblock revenue. Engineers also found a creative solution to the nagging problem of damaged tracks, which limited the train speed. Rather than purchasing new metal rails, which cost us $400 per ton, they ripped up tracks at abandoned stations and installed them on active routes. Use what you've got. 3 years later, Baring's discipline was paying off. Ali's performance improved from a net loss of 80 million reals in 1998 to a net profit of 24 million reals in 2000. Knowing what we know about the rider, it's no surprise that Baring's strategy worked. Baring had scripted the moves that helped his people make hard decisions. What tires out the rider and puts change efforts at risk is ambiguity, and Baring eliminated it. For every investment decision, his rules suggested the correct choice. To see the power of this, let's return to the doctors and the patient with the arthritic hip. Imagine that the leaders of the hospital had scripted their critical moves, and that one of those moves was this: use invasive options only as a last resort. Does anyone doubt that this guideline would have caused a big shift in the doctor's decisions? 4. In the shaded area that follows, we present a feature that we call a clinic. In each clinic, we describe a real-world situation and challenge you to think about how to apply the switch framework to create change. At the end of each clinic, we give our own suggestions, but we encourage you to generate your own game plan before you look at ours. The clinic is intended to be a kind of pause button, a chance to step outside the text and think about 58. How to apply what you've read. We hope you find this a useful way to practice applying the framework. The clinics are written to be sidebars. If you prefer to plow through the prose uninterrupted, you can return to them later. CLINIC. Can you get people to file their expense reports on time? Situation: Barbara, the controller of a consulting firm, is fuming again about expense reports. Why do people always turn them in late? The monthly due date was yesterday, and she's still missing 38% of the reports. That puts pressure on members of her team, especially on Maria, the expense czar, because they're expected to close the company's monthly books on time and the expense reports are a necessary input to the close. Frustrated, Barbara starts composing a reminder email, full of underlined words and exclamation points. The nag email has become a monthly tradition. Why does she have to shout before people do what they're supposed to? This is a fictional situation that is inspired by a true story. Many true stories. What's the switch and what's holding it back? The behavior Barbara wants is clear. Employees need to file their expense reports by the deadline. It's not obvious what the barrier is. Maybe the process is sufficiently complicated that it paralyzes the writer. Maybe the process is perfectly clear, but the elephant always finds things it would rather be doing. Or maybe the reporting systems are so antiquated that the path is one giant speed bump. Let's attack on all 3 fronts. How do we make the switch? Direct the writer. 1. Find the bright spots. Barbara should investigate her bright spots, the 62% of employees who file their expense reports on S59 time every month. What are they doing differently? Maybe they've handcrafted a set of techniques for logging expenses as they occur, so there's not a big pile at the end of the month. Once Barbara figures out the bright spots tricks, she can get them to share their system with others. 2. Script the critical moves. It's possible that parts of the reporting process are confusing enough to cause decision paralysis. Maybe there's ambiguity about how to code particular expenses, or how to allocate certain costs between clients. Barbara should observe a few laggards as they complete their reports. She won't know how to script the critical moves until she sees the confusion firsthand. Motivate the elephant. NT1. Find their feeling. Nobody who misses an expense report deadline feels anything. Sure, Barbara chastises laggards via email, but after they've received the nag note for the 6th consecutive month, it loses its sting. Barbara needs to find something people can care about. Or someone. After all, the company depends on people like Maria to close the books every month, and they'll be held accountable if they blow the deadline. So, in essence, their goal is not to file the report, it's to do Maria a favor, once a month. It may be easy to rationalize missing an administrative deadline, but it's harder to rationalize letting down a coworker who's counting on you. Shape the path. 1. Tweak the environment. How easy are the expense report forms to fill out? The accounting department should be obsessive about simplifying them, to the point of preloading people's names in their reports, and distributing empty envelopes for loose receipts. Think Amazon's L-click ordering. Every barrier that's removed makes the path clearer. 2. Rally the herd. Many people may conclude, falsely, that everyone turns in the reports late, that lateness is accepted behavior. Barbara's nagging emails may actually reinforce this perception. Why would she send them unless lots of people are slacking? People are sensitive to social norms, so Barbara's email should highlight the fact that almost 2/3 of reports are turned in on time. No one likes to hear that they're underperforming relative to their peers. 65. When Alexander Baring set up 4 simple rules for all employees to follow, they changed quickly. So did the West Virginians, who were urged to drink 1% milk. But why did these changes need to be scripted? Wasn't it obvious to the West Virginians that they should be drinking 1% milk instead of whole milk? Well, no, it wasn't. Not many people know that a glass of whole milk has the same amount of saturated fat as 5 bacon strips. That's not intuitive knowledge. Or was it intuitive for any of Baring's employees at all to decide, yeah, let's rip up old, abandoned tracks instead of purchasing new ones? When you want someone to behave in a new way, explain the new way clearly. Don't assume the new moves are obvious. To see why this is so important, consider a campaign that is essentially the antimatter version of the 1% milk campaign, a campaign that, while well-intentioned, systematically ignores or reverses every smart component of the 1% milk intervention. What would such an antimatter campaign look like? It might look very much like the United States government's food pyramid. My Pyramid Gov. Steps to a Healthier US 61. The food pyramid, which specifies the types and quantities of food that make up a healthy diet, is the perfect example of how not to change people's behavior. It's worth considering for a moment, because what dooms the pyramid could doom your efforts to create change in your life, as well. Let's start with the pyramid shape. A pyramid signifies hierarchy, yet no hierarchy is evident in the food pyramid. The first version of it displayed rows of food, one row on top of the next, with grains at the bottom and oils at the top. Some people interpreted this arrangement to mean that oils were the most important food group. Whoops. The revised version, shown here, abandoned the construct for vertical-ish streaks of color intended to eliminate any implied ranking. What this means is that the pyramid structure itself has no meaning whatsoever. The food pyramid might as well be a food rhombus or a food rooster. Look at it again, its meaning is almost completely opaque. What do the streaks mean? The only meaning that can be gleaned quickly comes from the stick figure dashing up the side. The meaning is clear enough, you should exercise the answers to more meaningful questions: how much? How often? What kind aren't as easy to infer, which of course adds more ambiguity. To learn what the food pyramid has to say about food, you must be willing to decipher the pyramid's markings. If you make the effort, you'll find that each streak of color represents a class of food. For instance, the yellow streak, the tiny one near the middle, is oils, and the orange streak on the far left is grains. If you dig even further, you'll find that with every color streak comes a recommendation. For instance, the USDA advises that adults consume about 5 to 7 teaspoons of oil each day. Quick, how many teaspoons of oil did you consume today? Quick, how many ounce equivalents of grain did you have today? 62. Can you imagine any message that would be less effective in changing people's eating behavior? The language and concepts here are so hopelessly abstracted from people's actual experience with food, which consists of things like buying groceries and ordering hamburgers at restaurants, not tabulating grain portions, that the message confuses and demoralizes. I can't understand this stuff. As an analogy, most of us have internalized the rule of thumb to get the oil in our cars changed every 3 months or 3,000 miles. It's transparent and actionable, like the 1% milk campaign. What if, instead, the auto industry publicized its version of the disastrous food pyramid, say, a car rainbow, where each color of the rainbow represents a different diagnostic test? Pink would warn you not to let your engine oil exceed a certain sludge threshold. Jiffy Lube would be out of business in months. Okay, the food pyramid is almost too easy to pick on. But the lessons here are serious and practical. If you are leading a change effort, you need to remove the ambiguity from your vision of change. Granted, this is asking a lot. It means that you'll need to understand how to script the critical moves, to translate aspirations into actions. It's not good enough to ask your team to be more creative or to tighten up on the purse strings. That's like telling the American public to be healthier. In a pioneering study of organizational change, described in the book The Critical Path to Corporate Renoir, researchers divided the change efforts they'd studied into 3 groups: the most successful, the top third; the average, the middle third; and the least successful, the bottom third. They found that, across the spectrum, almost everyone set goals, 89% of the top third and 86% of the bottom third. A typical goal might be to improve inventory turns by 50%. But the more successful change transformations were more likely to set world goals, 89% of the top third versus only 33% of the bottom 63 third. For instance, a behavioral goal might be the project teams would meet once a week and each team would include at least one representative of every functional area. Until you can ladder your way down from a change idea to a specific behavior, you are not ready to lead a switch. To create movement, you've got to be specific and be concrete. You've got to emulate 1% milk and flee from the food pyramid. 6. How far does this theory go? How much difference can specific instructions make? Let's subject the idea to the toughest possible test. Can you change child abusers by scripting some critical parenting moves for them? In 2004, a study was conducted of 0 parents who had abused their children. 73% of them had assaulted their kids, hitting or punching them with their fists. 20% had engaged in even more violent assaults, resulting in broken bones or severe lacerations. The parents tended to blame their abusive behavior on their kids. They'll say, "I had to discipline my child this way, because he's so rotten and he won't listen," said Beverly Funderburk, a research professor at the University of Oklahoma's Health Sciences Center. The parents believed that they'd gotten a bad kid, or a stubborn one, and that violence was the only way they could get their kids to obey. The mission of Funderburk's team was to change these parents, to stop their abuse. If you think that sounds naive and even hopeless, you're in good company. That's also what Funderburk worried about when she first began the work. She practices what's called parent-child interaction therapy (PCIT), which tries to disrupt the escalating cycles of coercion 64 and frustration that characterize abusive situations. In the first step of PCIT, parents are given an assignment. We want you to play with your child for 5 minutes a day. Here are the rules. You are going to devote 100% of your attention to turn. You're not going to answer the phone. You are not going to teach them their ABCs. You are just going to enjoy them. The parents are incredulous that 5 minutes will accomplish anything. "For goodness sake," said one parent, "I spend every minute of every day on this child." At first, these 5-minute play periods take place in a laboratory setting. The parent and child sit in an empty room with only a table and chairs. 3 or 4 toys are put on the tabletop. The parents are instructed to let the child lead the play session, and they're forbidden to give commands, to criticize, even to ask questions. Letting their child direct the action is incredibly difficult for them. During the play session, a therapist watches the parents through a one-way mirror, and gives real-time coaching by means of an earpiece. Funderburk describes a typical interaction. The parent and child might start coloring, and the parent tries to play along by coloring on the child's paper. Held objects. So we tell the parent, "Okay, get a separate piece of paper, and imitate what your child is doing." If the child is coloring a rainbow, the parent colors a rainbow too, saying, "I'm coloring a rainbow just like you. You're using green, I'm going to use green." And some kids, if they're particularly oppositional, might reach over and grab the parent's green crayon, yelling, "I want that." And we teach the parents to say, "Okay, I'd be happy to share that crayon with you. In fact, let me put all the crayons over by you so you can reach them all." Or perhaps the parent says, "I'm going to color my rainbow with pink now." And the child says, "Pink is ugly, don't do pink." If the child has been particularly nasty, we may just ask the parents to ignore the comment, but otherwise we coach the parents to agree with their child. "You're right. Pink is not a good color for the rainbow. I think I'll do red." We try to get the parents to bend like a reed. Whatever the child is doing, the parent offers no resistance, so the child has nothing to fight against. 65 An abusive parent typically finds the 5-minute exercise utterly exhausting. And you understand why the parent's writer has to supervise every single moment. Funderburk and her colleagues demand that the parents practice the same set of behaviors called child-directed interaction every day, whether in the lab or at home, so that the behaviors gradually become instinctive. The more instinctive a behavior becomes, the less self-control from the writer it requires, and thus the more sustainable it becomes. Parents are taught skills that feel unnatural at first. They are taught to look for opportunities to praise their kids' behavior. "I like how hard you're working. Good job. You're being very kind to that doll." They are taught to simply describe their child's behavior, so that the child feels noticed. "Oh, look, now you're putting the car in the garage." Later in the program, after parents have become better at having short positive interactions with their kids, they are taught how to give commands, so that their kids will listen and obey. They are taught a very specific formula for a command -66. Combining a command with a reason so the command doesn't feel arbitrary. "Johnny, it's almost time for the bus to come, so please put your shoes on now." Funderburk and her team at the University of Oklahoma studied 0 parents who had abused their children. Half of them were randomly assigned to take 1-2 sessions of PCIT, and the other half were assigned to take 1-2 sessions of a form of anger management therapy, focused on helping them control their emotions. Standard treatment for abusive parents. After the therapy sessions concluded, the parents were tracked for 3 years. Across 3 years, 60% of the anger management therapy group committed another act of child abuse. In contrast, only 20% of the PCIT parents re-offended. PELT did not eliminate the problem. 1 in 5 parents abused his or her kids again. From the perspective of behavior change, the results are staggering. Most of us believe in our hearts that child abusers are irredeemably flawed. Who could hate a child other than someone who is disturbed in some basic way? It simply boggles the mind to think that the behavior of ill abusers could be altered by only 12 sessions of therapy concentrating on such simple instructions. Thunderberg said, "In my experience, the physically abusive parent has the same goals as a normal parent. It's their method and their ideas that are wrong. They think that their child is woeful because they told their 3-year-old to just play in the front yard, and then he wandered off into the street. And they don't understand that a 3-year-old might forget an instruction, or might not have that kind of impulse control, so they think they have to punish the child for his own good, because he was disobedient and dangerous." Earlier, we said that what looks like stubbornness or opposition may actually be a lack of clarity. The parent intervention should SCRIPTTHECRITICLMOVES 67 suggests that child abuse, too, may be partly the result of a lack of understanding, a lack of clear instruction or guidance on what to do. This is not to excuse the parent's behavior, of course. It is simply to point out that moral scripting has power, beyond what any of us could have predicted. Even child abusers become pliable in its presence. 7. In 1995, the same year Brazil's President Cardoso announced the privatization of the railroads, a group of high school students in Howard, South Dakota, started plotting a revival. They wanted to do something, anything, that might revive their dying community. Howard and surrounding Minor County had been shrinking for decades. Farm and industrial jobs had slowly dried up, and nothing replaced them. The median price of houses in Howard was only $26,500. The population was about 3,000 and shrinking. The county had the highest elderly population per capita in South Dakota, and it also had the highest rate of youth outmigration in South Dakota, meaning that when young people got old enough, they left and didn't return. "We'd been in decline for 90 years, said Randy Perry, a longtime resident, who taught a business class at the local high school, coached the varsity basketball team, and ran an ice cream parlor on the side. At Howard High School, the students had just finished reading a book about the death of rural communities in Iowa. The students said, "That's us, it's JU's 70 years from now," according to Perry. So in class they started asking, how could we change this? Imagine the decision paralysis in this situation. Think of how 68. Many factors influence a town's health, its history, its demographics, its location, its economic base, its weather, among countless others. The problem was simply too complex for anyone to solve. And it wasn't for lack of motivation. There wasn't one person in Minor County who wouldn't have jumped at the chance to help rejuvenate the community. The elephant herd was ready to move. But where? What can a few people do to restore an entire county? The students started investigating the situation, designing a survey and distributing it to a sample of Minor County's registered voters. One finding in particular disturbed them. They discovered that half of the residents were shopping outside the county, driving an hour to Sioux Falls to shop in larger stores. If Minor County was going to be reborn, its economy would need a boost. Most of the things that would boost an economy, investment, entrepreneurship, immigration, were out of the students' control. But they had uncovered one thing that was very much in their control: spending money locally. They had found their first rallying cry: let's keep minor dollars in Minor County. Perry urged the students to present their findings to the community. The students accepted the challenge, and began to put together a presentation. The students' newfound interest in revitalization dovetailed with the efforts of others in the community. A group of other Minor County citizens had been hosting a series of meetings intended to get county residents talking about the future. They held 5 gatherings, some in the high school and some in people's homes, and they invited a cross-section of residents, farmers and business people and ministers and retirees. They challenged each other: what can we do to energize Minor County? The issues raised were all over the map. Why does our town look so shabby, with rusty cars on the street? Why should a farmer get S69 a subsidy, when a business person doesn't get a subsidy? Why don't we have a more thriving Main Street? Many of the issues were TBU, unsolvable by the community. Many required investment, but with a limited pool of tax dollars to draw from, it wasn't clear where they'd find the money. But there were a few things they knew they could take into their own hands. A gas station owner in the town of Fedora, population 150, complained that residents years ago had cut down a lot of diseased tree stumps were still littering the area, making Fedora look run down and sad. The group of concerned citizens decided to deal with the stumps in Fedora. One Saturday, farmers carrying chainsaws rode into Fedora on their tractors and loaders. Other residents made sandwiches and cookies for the workers. In a single day, the group dug up 400 stumps. Kathy Callies, who was heading up the kitchen crew that day, said it was amazing to see 50 people, ages ranging from 5 to 95, come together to do something for their community. Callies recalled that by the end of the day, people felt like, look at what we did in a day. And when you've dug up stumps together, and you start to realize you have shared ideas about what you want the community to be, then things start to happen. Notice that the aisle clearing day had powerful elephant and path elements, as well. The flush of victory of making a difference gave the elephant strength to continue. And the strong support of the community made the path feel less difficult. It's easier to make a long journey when you've got a herd around you. The community began to rally around the movement. Callies remembered the day that Phyllis, a civic-minded woman in her 80s, dropped by the office, where the community boosters were meeting. Phyllis announced, "I've been waiting for you to call me. I thought if you needed my help, you would call. But then I realized that they're all too busy to call, so here I am." On 70. Her refrigerator at home, Phyllis had posted a cross-stitch that said, "Screw the golden years." When the high school students were ready to unveil their recommendations, 85 residents gathered in the high school gym to hear the presentation. Among them were the top leaders of the towns in Minor County, the school boards, the city councils, and the county commissioners. The crowd listened attentively to the high school students. Perry said, "You could hear a pin drop." People said, one can't say no, because I want to make this a place where these kids can come home someday, because the other option is we sit here and keep watching things decline, so pretty soon all that will be left is the dust. The students had prepared an impressive array of spreadsheets and charts and graphs. But they'd also simplified the complex data into one simple, surprising fact. They'd calculated that if Howard residents spent just 10% more of their disposable income at home, they would boost the local economy by $7 million. The audience was impressed, and the presentation worked better than anyone expected. The students had scripted that first critical move for Minor County, and the locals responded immediately, consciously spending more of their money in the county. A year later, South Dakota's Department of Revenue released an astonishing number. The amount of money spent in Minor County had increased by $5.6 million, more than twice the increase the kids had expected. The change began to snowball. Suddenly, because the county was collecting more taxes, money was available to fund the other proposals the local groups had considered. And in the years following the students' presentation, the tax receipts kept climbing, which enabled the community to tackle even more ambitious S.7.1 problems. Later, Howard and Minor County received $6 million in grants from various foundations to fuel the transformation. Randy Perry left his teaching job and became a full-time revitalizer-in-chief. The town of Howard became the host to 21st-century businesses, such as an organic beef producer and a wind turbine repair shop. It all started small, said Perry. It's like when I took over the basketball team at the high school. They were just coming off of a losing season and you couldn't get people to come into the gym. But then you start to win and a few people come, and then more people come. And then we started winning a lot. To date, Perry has discussed the rebirth of Minor County with community leaders from 33 different states. 8. A railroad and a South Dakota small town. Both crumbling. Both with a dense thicket of problems and no real resources to use in untangling them. In each situation, an unlikely leader emerged, a young man fresh out of business school and a high school basketball coach. And both succeeded by formulating solutions that were strikingly smaller than the problems they were intended to solve. We've seen this asymmetry before, in the stories of Jerry Stern in Vietnam and Bobby the Troubled Teenager. The challenges facing Minor County were big and sprawling: the decline of an industrial base, the aging of a population. The citizens understood these challenges well, but the knowledge was true but useless. It was paralyzing knowledge. To the writer, a big problem calls for a big solution. But if you seek out a solution that's as complex as the problem, you'll get the food pyramid and nothing will change. The writer will just spin his wheels trying to make sense of it. The writer has to be 72. Jarred out of introspection, out of analysis. He needs a script that explains how to act, and that's why the successes we've seen have involved such crisp direction. Buy 1% milk. Don't spend cash unless it makes cash. Shop a little more in Minor County. We all hear a lot of common sense wisdom about change. People don't like to change, people resist change, people are set in their ways, people are stubborn. But here we've seen something else entirely: railroads made profitable, towns reborn, diets changed, and child abusers reformed. Clarity dissolves resistance. And Chapter 4. Point to the destination. 1. Crystal Jones joined Teach for America in 2003. She was assigned to teach the first grade class at an elementary school in Atlanta, Georgia. The school had no kindergarten, so for many of the kids, Jones would be their first teacher. At the beginning of the year, the skill gaps among her students were daunting. She said, "I had 2 or 3 students who could recognize kindergarten sight words, and I also had some that couldn't even hold their pencils. The ones who had never been to school, their basic behavior wasn't where it needed to be for them to be in the classroom. I had students that, of course, didn't know their alphabet or their numbers. They were all on different levels, and no one was really where they needed to be for first grade." Jones felt confident that she could elevate a kid's abilities. She could create great lesson plans and activities. She could script 74. The critical moves. But to what end? How do you show a room full of first graders where they're headed, and why going there is worth the effort in terms they can understand? Well, here's a way not to do that, from another Teach for America teacher, who reported her goals for the year as follows. With respect to reading for the school year, I administered 3 diagnostics: CWT, Assessment of Comprehension, and Monster Test. Using the CWT, I identified my classes average as grade level 1. 5 in September. My goal is to increase my students' word identification so as to ensure a class average of 3.0. Upon analyzing the results of the Assessment of Comprehension, I identified my classes average as a 41% in September. My goal is to increase my students' comprehension so as to ensure a class average of 80%. Using the Monster Test, I identified my classes average score as semi-phonetical phonetic. My goal is to increase my students' phonics and spelling skills to transitional. That ambitious and specific set of goals was probably quite useful to the teacher in her planning. But it obviously won't be useful in lighting a fire in the hearts of first graders. Crystal Jones, in contrast, knew that if she wanted to motivate the kids, she had to speak their language. At the beginning of the school year, she announced a goal for her class that she knew would captivate every student. By the end of the school year, you're going to be third graders. Not literally, of course, but in the sense that they would be at third grade skill levels. The goal was tailor-made for the first grade psyche. First graders know very well what third graders look like. They are 0.75 bigger, smarter, and cooler. You know that feeling you get when you're admiring the grace and power of an Olympic athlete. That's the feeling first graders get about third graders. Jones chose the goal carefully. She knew exactly what the third grade standards in Georgia required, and she knew where her kids were starting. She genuinely thought she could close the gap. One of her first efforts was to cultivate a culture of learning in her classroom, calling her students scholars and asking them to address one another that way. When people visited her classroom, she introduced her class as a group of scholars and asked them to define the term for the guest. They would shout, "A scholar is someone who lives to learn and is good at it." The scholars were encouraged to go home and share what they learned with their families. One day, a scholar was called out of the classroom for administrative reasons, and some of the others in the room started groaning. In most classrooms it would have been a groan of jealousy, "Get me out of here, too." Jones realized, to her surprise, that it was a groan of pity. The kid is going to miss some scholar work. At that moment, Jones says, "I knew I had them." By springtime, the kids' test scores had reached second grade level. So Jones threw a graduation ceremony right before spring break. For the rest of the year, the kids took great pleasure in referring to themselves as second graders. And by the end of the year, over 90% of the kids were reading at or above a third grade level. These were some of the same kids who, 9 months earlier, didn't know the alphabet. Crystal Jones's challenge is reminiscent of what Jim Collins and Jerry Porras, in Built to Last, their great study of long-lived business organizations, memorably called a BHAG, a big, hairy, 76. audacious goal. Henry Ford's BHAG early in the 20th century was to democratize the automobile. Walmart, in 1990, set the goal of quadrupling in size to be a $1.25 billion company by the year 2000. Collins and Porras defined a BHAG as an audacious 0 to 30-year goal to progress towards an envisioned future, and their research showed that setting these big, motivating goals was a practice that distinguishing lasting companies from less successful ones. In creating change, though, we are interested in goals that are closer at hand, the kinds of things that can be tackled by parents or middle managers or social activists. We want a goal that can be tackled in months or years, not decades. We want what we might call a destination post-size, sort of vivid picture from the near-term future that shows what could be possible. That's the missing piece of what we've discussed so far. We've seen the importance of pursuing bright spots, and we've discussed ways of instructing the writer how to behave, but we haven't answered a very basic question: where are we headed in the end? What's the destination? Crystal Jones provided a great destination postcard, YOULL be third graders soon. Notice that the goal she set for her students didn't only direct the writer, it also motivated the elephant. It was inspirational. It tapped into feeling. Collins and Porras knew that goals should have an emotional component. A BHAG shouldn't just be big and compelling, it should hit you in the gut. To a first grader, becoming a third grader in 9 months is a gut-smacking. 2. Women with breast cancer flew to San Francisco to be treated by Laura Esserman, a surgeon and an associate professor of surgery. 77 at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. Patients loved Esserman for her warmth and empathy. She gave out her personal cell phone number to her patients, and she sometimes sang patients to sleep in the operating room as their anesthesia took effect. Esserman's human touch was in sharp contrast to the usual treatment afforded women diagnosed with breast cancer. As if the diagnosis itself weren't frightening enough, women were often bounced around from place to place during the treatment cycle, adding stress. In a typical progression, described by a Stanford case study, a woman first notices a lump on her breast during a monthly self-exam. Anxious, she calls a doctor, and waits a few days or weeks for an appointment. The doctor confirms that the lump should be examined, so the patient is referred to a radiologist at another facility to get a mammogram. Getting the results of the scan takes another agonizing few days. The mammogram shows something suspicious, so she is referred to a surgeon, who meets her and again verifies that the lump is present. Unfortunately, the mammogram images didn't arrive at the surgeon's office before the visit, so there's another delay while radiology I contacted. The surgeon conducts a biopsy, which is sent to the pathology department, to determine whether the growth contains cancerous cells. The woman is sent home to wait by the phone for the answer. If cancer is detected, she undergoes surgery, and then the surgeon refers her to a radiation therapist for radiation treatment, and to a medical oncologist for chemotherapy. Radiation and chemotherapy are conducted at different sites with different booking procedures and delays. In an attempt to smooth the process, a patient might have to collect her own records, films, and pathology slides and carry them around herself, sometimes even within the same hospital. The sequence might take weeks to 78. Unfold, and all while the woman is wondering, am I going to live through this? This anxiety-filled process appalled Laura Esserman, and she had a vision of how it could be different. What if there were a breast care clinic, where a woman worried about a lump in her breast could walk in at the beginning of the day, and walk out at the end of the day with an answer, either knowing that the lump was no problem, or if it was a problem, having a treatment plan already in hand. The main barrier to this vision was the lack of coordination among medical departments. If they could be integrated more tightly, then weeks of agonizing waiting could be eliminated, the patient would not have to leave the building, and the experience would be designed around the patient's needs, not the department's. That was Esserman's destination postcard, and it was an admirable one. But as an associate professor at a large university medical center, Esserman was far down the totem pole, with few resources at her disposal. Even if she could start a breast care clinic, she would never be able to hire or fire the people who might work for it, and she couldn't even set their salaries. The medical departments, such as radiology and pathology, controlled the purse strings and the resources. The two most commonly used descriptions of the medical school at UCSF were bureaucratic and political. The departments have money, and the departments have turf, and you can't bring them together, said Meredith Mendelsohn, who became Esserman's chief administrative director. Esserman said, the radiation oncologists report to radiation oncology. The surgeons report to the School of Medicine. The medical oncologists report to medical oncology. The nurses and staff report to the medical center. The psychologists and social workers report someplace else. So it's an organizational challenge. 79, to make people feel like they belong to something. Because Esserman wielded so little institutional power, her best assets for creating change were her own tenacity and her ability to sell a vision of what breast cancer care could be. Esserman and Mendelsohn started small. They set up the breast care center to operate for 4 hours 1 day per week. They cajoled the medical departments to start working together in more integrated ways. It took practice, and it took persistence. Radiology, which does the mammographies, works like a train station, says Mendelsohn. If your appointment's at 1, 2, 1, 5, you're seen at 1, 2, 1, 5 and that's how they operate. But Esserman's goal was to build treatment around the patient's needs, and those needs weren't always predictable enough to conform to radiology's schedule. Esserman worked with the radiologists to figure out how to create some flexibility in their traditionally rigid processes. We couldn't take up too much of radiology's time, said Mendelsohn, so they figured out how to improvise. Drive. Esserman would see the patient in the morning, and she was the only doctor that would do it. She was the guinea pig, and then she would send them off, say go have lunch. Go shopping. Come back at 1, and during lunchtime she would go to radiology, where she and the radiologist would sit and look through all of the images, and decide what needed to happen next. For the first year, the center stuck with the 1 day per week model. Then, once the work was going smoothly, Esserman expanded to 2 days per week. More surgeons started to get involved, and then nurses, and counselors, and support staff, and the snowball began. Eventually, the breast care center achieved enough success that it was offered an entire floor in the new cancer center being constructed by UCSF. Where's radiology? Asked Esserman 80. When she saw the layout. The cancer center master plan assumed that the radiology department would remain in its old building. But that would have made Esserman's everything under one roof vision impossible. So she agreed to give up 1/3 of the breast care center space to make room for a mammography unit on the same floor. Onlookers were shocked. Academic departments usually fought hard to secure space, and Esserman was giving up some of hers. Now Esserman had 2 powerful assets, a proper home for his center and a staff who increasingly embraced her vision for a new kind of care. Patients flocked to the breast cancer center. From 1,997 to 2003, the number of patients seen per month skyrocketed from 175 to 1,300. In time, the center became a major source of revenue for UC5F and a recognized national leader in breast cancer care and research. The center evolved to be the place that Esserman described in her destination postcard. Here's how Esserman describes the way the patient's experience looks today. When a patient comes into the breast care center, I can walk around the corner and look at her films that day. While she's in the room, we can do a biopsy and get the diagnosis in 5 minutes. We have a gynecologist on staff that specializes in fertility issues for women with breast cancer, and I have a psychologist and genetic counselor on staff that is one of the nurse practitioners. The patient stays in the same place and doesn't need to go anywhere. The breast care center also has a relaxing healing garden and a cafe that serves coffee. The boutique sells not only the usual 0.81 flowers and gifts but also wigs and scarves for patients undergoing chemo. For the first time, said Esserman, we put the woman at the center. 3. When you describe a compelling destination, you're helping to correct one of the writer's great weaknesses, the tendency to get lost in analysis. Our first instinct, in most change situations, is to offer up data to people's writers. Here's why we need to change. Here are the tables and graphs and charts that prove it. The writer loves this. He'll start pawing over the data, analyzing it and poking holes in it, and he'll be inclined to debate with you about the conclusions you've drawn. To the writer, the analyzing phase is often more satisfying than the doing phase, and that's dangerous for your switch. Notice what happens, though, when you point to an attractive destination, the writer starts applying his strengths to figuring out how to get there. For instance, after Esserman announced her under one roof vision, her team could start thinking through the implications of that. Let's see, we'll never pull that off unless we have access to radiology, so we'll need to give up square footage to them. You have a choice about how to use the writer's energy. By default, he'll obsess about which way to move, or whether it's necessary to move at all. But you can redirect that energy to helping you navigate toward the destination. For that to happen, you need a gut-smacking goal, one that appeals to both writer and elephant. Think of Esserman's under one roof vision, or of Crystal Jones's challenge to her kids to become third graders. 82. Goals in most organizations, however, lack emotional resonance. Instead, SMART goals that are specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely have become the norm. A typical SMART goal might be my marketing campaign will generate 4,500 qualified sales leads for the sales group by the end of Q39. The specificity of SMART goals is a great cure for the worst sins of goal-setting, ambiguity and irrelevance. We are going to delight our customers every day in every way. But SMART goals are better for steady-state situations than for change situations, because the assumptions underlying them are that the goals are worthwhile. If you accept that generating 4,500 leads for the sales force is a great use of your time, the SMART goal will be effective. But if a new boss, pushing a new direction, assigns you the 4,500 leads goal, even though you've never handled lead generation before, then there might be trouble. SMART goals presume the emotion, they don't generate it. In looking for a goal that reaches the elephant, that hits people in the gut, you can't bank on SMART goals. There are some people whose hearts are set aflutter by goals such as improving the liquidity ratio by 30% over the next 8 months. They're called accountants. In the 1980s, a major study of corporate change efforts found that financial goals inspired successful change less well than did more emotional goals, such as the goal to provide better service to customers or to make more useful products. According to the researchers, effective visions expressed values that allow employees to identify with the organization. One manager at a glass company suggested, "It's hard to get excited about 1.5% return on equity destination postcards do double duty. They show the writer where you're headed, and they show the elephant why the journey is worthwhile." POINTTOTHEDESTINTIONCLINIC. How can you get corporations to avoid short-term thinking?